Greetings and various assorted salutations. Today's feature presentation is on the Inca. First off, we've got to start with the cultural references. The Incans actually don't come up a whole lot. There's really one instance where they come up, and you can probably guess it. It's the Emperor's New Groove. Or at least that's the case in English-speaking parts of the world. One of the things that's kind of issue is pre-Columbian. So pre-Columbian is before Spanish contact. Civilizations often get mashed together in pop culture. If you're a fan of the website TV Tropes, they call it kind of Maya Inca Tech, which basically you take Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incans, and you mash them all together to get something. And part of the reason why there isn't a whole lot of distinction is a lot of TV shows, incidentally children's TV shows, they want to talk about the ancient Aztecs, the ancient Mayans, or the Incans, but they're not. They know or they themselves don't know a whole lot about those civilizations, but there's a certain aesthetic you can kind of capture. And so you just pull bits and pieces from those things to kind of create the ancient civilization that's set in the Americas, vaguely. Because people know what the Romans look like, people know what the Greeks look like, people know what the Egyptians look like, and people know what a mashup of these three look like. Even though we know as historians that Aztecs, Mayans, and Incans are distinct, pop culture doesn't always know the difference. Thank you, Hollywood history, for messing that up. And the one example we have is the Emperor's New Groove, which actually separates them out. And the other tricky part is the Incans are very distinct from the Aztecs and the Mayans. The Aztecs and the Mayans have more closer connections, but even they're distinct from each other. The Incans are really doing their own thing for most of their history. There is some trade connections, but the Incans are really kind of a world unto themselves, a very high up world in the mountains. Anyways, let's get into the basics. So, who? Incan is actually not a correct term. It's actually Inca, and Inca only refers to the ruling nobility class, as I've misspelled there. The Inca were about 15,000 to 40,000 people, and they represent the noble elite class. So we're talking about the emperor, his high-ranked servants, nobles, and high-ranked warriors. These were the people who ruled over the empire of the Inca. And the empire as a total probably had around 10 million people in it. The Spanish, in their effort to simplify things, just referred to everyone as Inca. It's a very gross, very simple, very large simplification. It's kind of like if you want an example, the Spanish again did this one again, but many Africans who were brought over, they came from all different walks of life, but on the Spanish ships, they were referred to as black, and that was it. And so once again, here's the Inca is a vast oversimplification of a very large, diverse group of groups of peoples, and so that's why we refer to them as the Inca. There's a whole bunch of other people in there, but that's what the Spanish used, and that's what historians have kind of rolled with since, and it's what the average person says. Now the where is where things get interesting. The Inca are located in South America on the Andes mountain range. So parts of Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, and Colombia. And so the Inca are one of the most interesting civilizations in that their civilization is almost entirely built on the sides of or along mountains. And the other thing you can see here is we've got a road system. They had a very elaborate, large road system that united and connected their empire. Kind of a road that ran along the spine of the Andes Mountains. And you can see on this map that that's pretty much where the Incans operated. But you can see this map. If you want to ever look at my slides, I put links to my slides in the descriptions, and you can look at this map in more detail. This is a political map of South America as of 2013, and you can kind of see this as the run-along of it. There's another political map. So when this empire existed is between 1438 and 1533. It's actually not that old of an empire when you get right down to it. And there were a few other actually longer-lasting empires that existed before the Inca. The Inca were a relatively new, short-lived empire, and they were all centered around the city of Cusco. But how the Incan Empire operated, or Inca operated, was it was a highly centralized government that organized communities throughout the empire to carry out agriculture, military service, and coordinated trade. Essentially, the government kind of had a central planning model, and so like when one region was prosperous, they would use the resources from that region in the less prosperous regions. And essentially, the communities were organized around this kind of communal public service thing, which I'm going to mispronounce the pronunciation, but the mita. And this system, it's indicated that the Incans didn't even invent this system. There's a lot of indications that this communal public service system predates the empire. And still in some parts to this day, this system of a community has a certain amount of time, effort, and individual work time set aside to the community is still found in some parts of the former Incan Empire to this day. The idea that a portion of your work, a portion of your production would go towards the community effort. I'm sure there's a Marxist who finds this utterly fascinating. But the Inca civilization would use it. And actually the Spanish Empire would continue to use it. So it just really shows how ingrained some institutions were. If you ever take a history on colonial Spanish Empire, you'll find that the Spanish, while they did introduce Catholicism, while they did introduce European methods of governance, they often used a lot of older systems that were put in either before the Aztecs, before the Mayans, before the Incans to organize their society. And in fact, you can kind of look at it at some of the historical sources, and really the big change you have is the leadership at the top. But a lot of day-to-day operations in some areas look remarkably similar. But no. The other thing that makes the Incans interesting is they were highly organized. Their farming, they developed terraced farming, which you may not really think, oh, what's the big deal about that? It takes a fair amount of organization to create terraced farming and irrigation. You need a fairly organized and stable society to build and farm in this method, because it requires upkeep and maintenance as well. You can kind of see that some of these are still in use today. Also, alpacas and llamas were domesticated by the Inca, and alpacas were used predominantly for wool and meat, and llamas were used for pack animals as well. They could carry goods. Alpacas and llamas are related to camels, and so if you know anything about camels, while you can domesticate these animals, they're not exactly as docile as, say, cattle, pigs, or horses. And so, while the Inca had access to these animals, a lot of Inca achievements were done by human hands. And there's some more of these animals. Going into notable accomplishments, architecture. Inca architecture is some of the most impressive ancient civilization architecture. They built at high altitudes. They built earthquake, volcanic resistant facilities, and they did so without ever inventing concrete or mortar. Essentially, every brick you see in that picture fits perfectly into where it's supposed to go. Incan architecture is very precise. And everything was designed to fit and withstand earthquakes, volcanic activity by fitting the stones in perfectly. It's to a degree of precision that we can't even fully replicate with computers to this day. And this is the picture of the famous Machu Picchu city site. Now, the other interesting thing that make the Inca different, so the Aztecs had reading and writing, the Maya had reading and writing, and were known for having a particularly complex writing system that was very articulate. You could do a lot with the Maya writing system. And both Aztecs and Maya had mathematical systems as well. But the Inca are fascinating because there's no written language. They had an incredibly complex, large empire that stretched that entire mountain range practically, and they had no written language to get the point across. What they did have is they would have these knot systems. You take rope, which they made by braiding, I think alpaca or llama wool was one of the ways they did it. And essentially with this knot system, you could communicate. Unfortunately, the way of reading these knots is completely lost to history, but we still have some samples of what it looked like. But these were used to convey messages, and they could be sent up and down the roads of the empire to kind of communicate how to move resources and things like that. But unfortunately, we just can no longer read what these are. But it's fascinating that they didn't develop writing, but they developed something completely different, and it worked for them. The other thing that's also interesting is, well, the Inca live at high altitudes, which is not exactly very common for humans, especially much less common is that an entire civilization lives at a high altitude in this time period, or previous time periods. But interestingly enough, as a result, the people of the Inca Empire had larger lung capacities, slower heart rates, and a higher red blood cell count due to that high altitude living. You know how it is when you go to a higher altitude, sometimes you have to adjust or you get altitude sickness. The other major development that we have is their road system. Their road system is brilliant. It's based around footpaths and bridges. In fact, the methods of bridges that they used in this time period are sometimes still used to this day. In fact, some of their footpaths are still used. Here's a footpath along a flatter stretch of land. But what made the Inca interesting is their road system was very highly developed. They had rest stops, way stations for the people carrying the knot messages to go back and forth. And it was just a very effective and efficient way to get around their empire. And it was designed around getting around on foot, because remember, they did not have horses. And while you can load cargo up on llamas, that doesn't mean you can exactly ride llamas. Or at least they didn't. Now let's go to the downfall of the Inca. What happens is the Spanish come in, Conquistador Francisco Pizarro came in at the worst possible time for the Incan Empire. For the Spanish, it couldn't have been a better time, but for the Incas, the worst imaginable time. The reason why I'm going over these conquistadors is the Spanish did not conquer the Spanish Empire. They didn't build the Spanish Empire necessarily in a way that we would think about. Essentially, conquistadors are types of soldiers that they would often act in the name of the Spanish Empire, but they were not necessarily fully connected to the Spanish Empire as like formal official positions. So like Cortez, Pizarro, and others, they were often kind of nobles who went forth and put together their own teams to go out and take various areas. The idea of the conquistadors is that they'd conquer in the name of Spain, and they would convert whoever was found in whatever lands they conquered into Catholicism. Um, and so that's kind of where that's what the conquistadors are. If you're wondering where they come from, it's actually a very medieval concept. The conquistadors were a key part of the Reconquista, where the Spanish kingdom took the Iberian, the peninsula where Spain and Portugal are located, from the Moorish kingdoms, the Islamic kingdom of the Moors. And so essentially what the Spanish did when they took over the Americas, they took all the methods that they used in the Crusades against the Moorish Empire, and they just dropped those exact same tactics right into the New World. And it worked with relatively ruthless effectiveness. And the conquistadors were ruthless. So, anyways, essentially, when the Spanish came upon the Inca, a civil war had just ended. The emperor, the reason for this civil war is, while the Spanish hadn't gotten down to the Inca yet, smallpox, through trade connections with the Maya, the Aztec, and various other groups, those trade networks had already brought smallpox in to the Inca Empire, much like the trade in Venice brought the Black Death into Europe from Asia. But essentially, the emperor had died, and there was a succession crisis, a fight amongst relatives and other individuals to see who should rule the empire next. A lot of people were unhappy with the empire because of the Civil War. Because essentially what happened is, of course, the faction, if you were on the losing team in the Civil War, you were not going to be treated as well as the winning factions. Additionally, thanks to the Civil War, a lot of the central government was disorganized, because what had happened is the central government made sure that if one province was suffering, resources were pulled. Well, during the Civil War, resources weren't getting moved around, and central planning had completely fallen apart. And so there were a lot of people who were still paying taxes, but they weren't seeing a lot of benefit from being under the Inca rule. Additionally, in the smallpox, you had influenza, typhus, measles, all those European diseases were ravishing the countryside and the trade net, and spreading through those same roads we talked about. The other thing that some historians theorize is that the Inca had overexpanded. The Inca were a relatively new empire, and their rulers were quite ambitious. And so they expanded a lot, and there probably hadn't been enough time to really consolidate and centralize and keep things in order. And so, once again, when the Spanish came in, they were able to find people who were disgruntled with the Inca Empire and were willing to provide the Spanish with manpower, information, to overthrow them. And like what the Spanish did in Mexico, to create that portion, the Spanish kind of installed themselves as the replacement to the Inca eventually. And the Spanish needed these local forces to take over. Pizarro had 168 Spanish soldiers, and while the Spanish soldiers were well equipped, they're working in a foreign land. They have a lot of challenges, the high altitude stuff as well, and so they really needed support from different anti-Inca government groups. Now we'll look at it more. If we don't look at it in this unit, we will have looked at it in the Aztec unit. But the conquistadors had a lot of late high Renaissance weapons, lances, long swords, and one of the precursors to modern guns as some of their weapons, as well as horseback, cavalry. The conquistadors were well equipped. This is a sample of some of their weapons. And, of course, the Spanish did have access to plate body armor, which was very resistant to many weapons in the New World. But essentially, one of the traits that we see with the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incans is their quote-unquote ancient world runs a bit longer than in Europe and Asia and Africa, because essentially there isn't a firmly argued point, but what happens is at some point we get the modern world. And generally, a lot of people say when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, that created lasting trade connections between all parts of the world. And that's when many people say world history began, is when the world became fully connected. Anyways, this is one of the last formal lectures for ancient civilizations, and it has been an introduction into the Inca and a little bit as well into the Spanish conquest. So I hope this has proved helpful.